We're going to begin with our study in the book of Proverbs. And everyone should have one of the handouts. And there actually are 2 pages on the handout. And the back has some extra detail that you may want to have wanted to write down. And I thought it would just be quicker to put it on the back. And so we're going to be looking at Proverbs, and it's a book that probably doesn't get as much attention as it should get. It's about wisdom. It's about dealing with today's tasks, the things that we face today. It's about dealing with the dilemmas that we face, and about dealing with the opportunities that come along. And the words of Proverbs are transferable from the time it was written into our time. And it's especially relevant when you begin to deal with and you read it and you begin to relate it to everyday life in the 21st century. You discover that it's just as relevant now as it was when it was written. And so I want to look at, first of all, what do we know about the book? So going into it, what do we know about the book? Anybody like to start us off? What do we know about the book going in? Okay, written by Solomon.
Mostly attributed to Solomon.
Mostly attributed to Solomon. Anybody else? All right, there are 31 chapters. And the interesting thing about that is, and it's often suggested as a Bible reading plan, that you can read 1 chapter a day of the book of Proverbs, and you will read the entire book through in a month. And it's great wisdom. All right, so we know it's written by Solomon. It has 31 chapters. We know it's in the Old Testament. We're going to look at, first of all, the positioning of the book and how it relates to us. So in the Hebrew Old Testament, there were basically 3 groupings of books. Anybody like to take a stab at what those are? Okay, sure.
The law, the prophets, and
It's that last one, yeah. The law and the prophets. Jesus spoke about it and spoke of it as the law and the prophets. And sometimes the 3rd division is actually included in with the prophets. And that's the books of wisdom or the books of the sages. So there are basically 3 divisions: the law, the prophets, and the writings, which include the poetic and the wisdom books. And it's interesting as well because ancient Israel had 3 categories of ministers. Those who would minister before the Lord. There were the priests, the prophets, and the one that we often don't recognize were a category that they would refer to as the sages or the wise men. And the sages were gifted with godly wisdom. They would share that with the kings and with the leaders. They were the ones who gave counsel, the sages. And so they would deal with the practical issues of life. They would deal with theological questions, philosophical issues. And Proverbs is a representation of inspired wisdom for the ages. So as we look at it, we're going to look at the date first. And it was written between 970 and 700 BC. So it was written a long time ago, almost 3,000 years ago. And the wonder of it is that something written 3,000 years ago still gives such detailed wisdom for us today. And of course, you see the wisdom of the sages, but you also see God's wisdom at work within these writings. And there are a few things we're going to be looking at as we go through. First of all, it's the word proverb is taken from a Hebrew word mashal, M-A-S-H-A-L, and it means an oracle, a proverb, or a wise saying. So an oracle, a proverb, or a wise saying. And there are some longer passages in the book, which will be spoken of as an oracle. And I'm not going to go into all of those tonight. We'll be covering some of them as we go through. And there are a lot of short, really to the point statements. So as you read a chapter, the chapter is not necessarily all one thought or all one subject. There will be many different subjects that may be taken on in one chapter. There will be some subjects that are dealt with in varying chapters throughout the book. He doesn't just take and deal with it all in one or two chapters. It'll be spread out through the book. And they're short and to the point. They're not long, usually. Very short, very to the point. And it's important for us to remember this, that Hebrew Proverbs are generalized statements. And I've got this on the screen because it's really important to remember. They are generalized statements about what is usually true in life. So generalized statements about what is usually true in life. So they're not to be treated as promises. They're about what is generally true in life. For instance, I'll put one up on the screen. Proverbs 17:17. A friend loveth at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. But sometimes even the best of friends have disagreements. So they are general truths, nuggets of wisdom, about how life usually works. For instance, Proverbs 15 and verse 1, a great one. If you don't have this one underlined, it's a great proverb to live by. A soft answer turneth away wrath, but grievous words stir up anger. Anybody here ever had somebody be angry? You gave them a soft answer and they continued to be angry? I have. So a soft answer turneth away wrath is a general truth. I've also had it when somebody's been really angry, and when you refuse to ramp up, when you refuse to power up and respond with anger, when you give them a kind reply without raising your voice, that quite often the situation is diffused, it stops, and you can have a rational conversation. But then there are other times when, well, they just don't seem to hear it. And it continues on. So, but as a general truth, and Proverbs are written as wisdom literature, so they are the way that life usually works. And so they're not meant to be taken as promises. So if somebody's really angry, you give them a soft answer and they continue on. Understand, this is a general truth. It's not a promise that every time that you give a soft answer, they're just going to stop. But it's a general truth that this is what will happen. And so it should be our behavior, but sometimes the anger continues. And so it's a great general rule. And the book of Proverbs represents a form of teaching that was very popular way back in the Old Testament. And it was very common. And the book of Proverbs is very distinctive in that its wisdom is given in the context and given in the understanding about God and his righteous standards for his people, or God and what he wants for his people. So when we look at Proverbs, it teaches us about morality. It teaches us about how we should handle situations to be godly. Now, this type of teaching was really popular for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's very clear. It's short, it's clear, to the point. It's very easy to memorize. A soft answer turns away wrath. Easy to remember. It's easy to memorize. Pride goeth before destruction. Easy to memorize. And it was easy to pass them on from generation to generation. And so in a day when most people didn't have books, and most people didn't have writings or anything, any way to pass things along, then a proverb was something that was easily transferable. You could pass it on. It's like a catchphrase. It's like a statement that we will make that we remember. And, it's like when you're turning with a wrench, and you're turning, how's it go?
Lefty loosey, righty tighty.
Lefty loosey, righty tighty. An easy way to remember. And while that's not quite a proverb or even wisdom literature, it does come in handy sometimes. And so most people didn't have their own copies of the sacred books. They had to depend on memory, and wisdom literature was a very easy way to remember it because it was kind of catchy as well. So if Solomon had written a whole lecture on pride and he had written pages on it, it'd be really tough to remember. So he wrote a proverb. And of course, Proverbs 16 verse 18, I just quoted it, pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. Well, that kind of relates what we need to know about pride. So just something catchy, 7 words in the Hebrew, and even a child can memorize it. Pride goes before destruction. I memorized that really young because my mother used to like to quote it. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. A Spanish novelist, Cervantes, defined a proverb as a short sentence based on long experience. And really, that's what these proverbs are all about. The wisdom of the wise men, inspired by God, over long experience. Somebody said, well, we need to have wisdom. Somebody else said, how do you get it? And I said, well, through experience. And really, when you think about your life, you gain wisdom by the things you go through. I'm thankful that there are people who can speak into your life that you can learn from, but we really gain wisdom through the things that we go through and when we learn from those things. And almost every nation, every culture has different little proverbs. I've heard some from the islands, and some of them that are kind of unique to the islands. We have nothing ventured, nothing gained. That actually was started by Chaucer way back in around 1500, I think it was, or somewhere around that time. And how about a stitch in time saves 9? And of course, what it means is that if you put, and using, if you were sewing or if you were repairing something, that when a tear is very small, if you put 1 stitch, when it's very small, it'll save you 9 stitches when it rips out, and you could have saved yourself 9 stitches. And so what does that proverb teach us, Brother Brent? Don't procrastinate. Get it done. Look after it when it's small. So, a stitch in time saves 9. The next 2 are kind of, they kind of counter each other. Ever heard the one, he who hesitates is lost? No? If you hesitate, the opportunity is going to pass by. He who hesitates is lost. And then the other one is, look before you leap. Make sure you know where you're leaping. Make sure you know where you're jumping. And those are man-made proverbs. And actually, those 2 kind of contradict each other. He who hesitates is lost. Look before you leap kind of contradict. What are some other well-known proverbs that we use? Anybody have any other ones?
The early bird gets the worm.
The early bird gets the worm. And so it tells us,
Do things early.
get on it. Yeah. Don't procrastinate. There we go. Well, don't procrastinate. Anybody else have one? What is a watch pot? Never boils. Actually, it does just as quickly as when you're not watching. It just seems longer. And so it's all about focus. Anybody else have one? Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Rolling stone gathers no moss. There we go. Yes.
The grass is always green on the other side of the fence.
The grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. Okay, good. Don't cut off your nose to spite your face.
I don't know that one.
Anybody else have one?
But in the Alan Joseph, seeing blind, hearing deaf, but this is.
Seeing blind, hearing deaf. Okay.
It means, not everything you see you're gonna talk, and everything you hear you're gonna repeat.
Okay. So there's all kinds of proverbs. So we're going to get into the actual book. As was mentioned earlier, the book of Proverbs actually has several writers. Most of them are attributed to Solomon, and we'll look at them. First of all, there's Solomon. Proverbs chapter 1, verse 1 speaks of the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel. And also in Proverbs 10 and verse 1, it speaks of the Proverbs of Solomon. So what David is to the book of Psalms, Solomon is to the book of Proverbs. Of course, David wrote most of the book of Psalms. Solomon wrote most of the book of Proverbs. And 1 Kings chapter 4, before we put that up on the screen, does anybody know how many Proverbs that Solomon actually wrote? He's good. 3,000. Let's put it up on the screen. 1 Kings 4:32. And he spake 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were, I should have asked how many songs. 1,005. So 3,000 proverbs and 1,005 songs. So he was busy. The interesting thing about Solomon was he began his life and his reign as a king as a man of wisdom, and then he ended his life by practicing great folly, or he wasn't very wise in some of the things that he did. And Solomon became involved in alliances with other nations, and his heart was turned away from God. And so he was a man whose wisdom was noted. It was written that they came from around the world to listen to hear the wisdom of Solomon. And the second writer is a man named Agur. Agur. And you find him referenced in chapter 30. What do we know about Agur? Or Agur? Actually, that's all we know about him.
He's the son of,
We know nothing about him.
the son of Jacob.
And then we have King Lemuel in chapter 31. What do we know about King Lemuel?
Wise mother.
He had a wise mother, yes. Because it starts out talking about the sayings of the mother of King Lemuel. Who was King Lemuel?
I remember hearing that it might be Solomon.
Most likely, most commentators believe that King Lemuel is another reference to Solomon. There was no king of Israel referenced by that name, and the name actually means dedicated to God. And so many scholars believe that it actually was just another reference to Solomon. But he is listed King Lemuel. And then the fourth one is the sages or the wise men. The sages or the wise men. And you see that reference from chapter 22 to chapter 24. So the sages or wise men. And in Proverbs 25, it references the men of Hezekiah. And most likely, those men of Hezekiah were the men around 675 BC who actually put the Proverbs together. So they were compiled together, most likely by these wise men of Hezekiah. Now, I want to look at the purpose of the book. Why was Proverbs written? And the best way to find that is basically to look at the scripture itself. But the first Proverbs was written, and the purpose of it was to provide wisdom for living and a basis to live from. So wisdom for living and a basis that we could direct our lives from. Wisdom for living and a basis to live from. And we're going to look at Proverbs chapter 1. Now, next week, we're going to do or have a look at Proverbs chapter 1 in its entirety. But tonight I want to look at just a few verses that are found there, starting with verse number 2. This is New Living. Their purpose is to teach people wisdom and discipline, to help them understand the insights of the wise. Their purpose in verse 3 is to teach people to live disciplined and successful lives, to help them do what is right, just, and fair. So you'll notice as the writer begins, and as Proverbs begin, they make a statement of what the purpose of the book is. And that is, we're going to teach people wisdom and discipline. And we're going to help them to understand the insights of the wise. So this is going to be like a university degree in wisdom. And then, of course, to teach how to live disciplined and successful lives, to help them to do what is right, just, and fair. So that's the purpose of the book, or part of the purpose of the book. And then, in verse number 4, these proverbs will give insight to the simple, knowledge and discernment to the young. So he's covering pretty much everybody. He's saying the simple can become wise, and young people can gain knowledge and discernment through what's written in the book of Proverbs. So the purpose is to help people to have wisdom along the way, to be able to make right decisions, to be able to have discipline within their lives. And then in verse 5, let the wise listen to these proverbs and become even wiser. Let those with understanding receive guidance. So he's saying you are never too wise that you can't learn some more. And that, I think, is a crucial point of wisdom. That a wise person understands there's always something else to learn. They never say, I've arrived, I'm going to shut down now, I don't need to learn anything more. But a wise person continues to learn. It doesn't matter how old you are, there are always things to learn. There's always better ways of making decisions. And so he said, let the wise listen to these proverbs, become even wiser. Those with understanding receive guidance. And verse number 6, by exploring the meaning in these proverbs and parables, the words of the wise and their riddles. So there will be some things that will be challenging. There'll be some things about Proverbs that you'll have to figure out. But in doing so, you become wiser. You learn from it. And then in verse number 7, he gives us a foundation. And that is that the fear of the Lord is the foundation of true knowledge. And the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. But fools despise wisdom and discipline. So he gives us the basis for it all. And he says that it all starts with the fear of the Lord. How would you define the fear of the Lord? I know we've talked about it before, but how would you define the fear of the Lord?
Respect for what he is and all that he can be and do.
Sure. Respect for what he is and all that he can do. So, I think it's important for us to understand what the fear of the Lord is not. And it doesn't mean that I live in deathly fear of God all the time. But the fear of the Lord is that sense of reverence, respect, and awe in realizing how great God is. And I think also that there's a very vital aspect of it, and that aspect is love. That I love God and I respect God. And the fear of the Lord is a reverence or an honor or respect for God because I love him and because of who he is and what he does. So the fear of the Lord is that sense of awe and majesty for the greatness of God and for God himself. And as we go through the book, I want to use actually that verse, verse 7, as the key verse for the book. Chapter 1, verse 7. And I put it on the King James as well. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. And later on, he rephrases that and says it's the beginning of wisdom. In the Amplified, in verse number 7, here's what it said. The reverent and worshipful fear of the Lord is the beginning and the principal and choice part of knowledge, its starting point and its essence. But fools despise skillful and godly wisdom, instruction, and discipline. So that fear, that reverence for the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. It gives me a basis to work from in understanding life and in understanding what's going on around me. Proverbs 9 and 10 amplifies it again. And I referenced it a moment ago. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the holy is understanding. So the fear of the Lord is where we start with knowledge and with wisdom, that reverence and honor and respect for God. The New Living put verse 10 is this: fear of the Lord is the foundation of wisdom. It's what you need to really have a good basis for understanding things around us and for working out from. In the book of Proverbs, and I'm not going to put them all on the screen, but there are 18 references to the fear of the Lord or the fear of God. And we're going to put them up on the screen. This isn't all of them. I think I have 14 of them that'll be on the screen. And so we'll take a quick look at some of them here. In verse 7, chapter 1, the beginning of knowledge. In verse 29, the fear of the Lord brings answered prayer. And these are actually on the back of your study sheet. The fear of the Lord brings answered prayer. In chapter 2, verse 5, it's equated with knowledge. Chapter 8, verse 13, the fear of the Lord is to hate evil. In verse 10 of chapter 9, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Verse 27 of chapter 10, it prolongs days. Verse 26 of chapter 14, it gives strong confidence. Chapter 14, verse 27, it's a fountain of life. Chapter 15, verse 16, is better than great treasure with trouble. It's the instruction of wisdom in chapter 15. Chapter 19, it leads to life. Chapter 16 leads one from evil. Chapter 22 brings riches, honor, and life. Chapter 23, it rewards hope. All of these things are the results of the fear of the Lord as we reverence and honor God within our lives. Wisdom begins with a right relationship with God. That's where it all starts. And Proverbs is really important because Proverbs does away with the distinction between the sacred and the secular. And that's a distinction that a lot of people make today. There's the sacred part of life, the going to church part of life, and then there's everything else. But Proverbs really does away with the distinction that we try to make between sacred and secular, because Proverbs will not allow you to live in the land of the theoretical. Proverbs is about applied wisdom. It's about applying the wisdom of God within our lives to change our lives. So it forces the person who is reading it to translate principles into practice. That here is what God's wisdom for our life looks like. And of course, we always, as we go into an introduction of the book, we look at a theme for the book. And the theme for this book, if the purpose is to help us to live lives full of wisdom, then the theme of the book is simply to get and to apply God's wisdom. Get and apply wisdom. Actually, throughout the book, it refers to wisdom almost as a person. And it tells us to get wisdom. And the words wise and wisdom are used at least 125 times throughout the book of Proverbs. So 125 times he speaks of wisdom. And here's a question. Is a smart person always a wise person? No? There is a difference between knowledge and wisdom. And knowledge, you know a lot of facts. I've known people who I marvel at their recall. How they seem, everything they've read, they remember. And I'm just kind of scratching my head and saying, well, I wish I could remember things like that. And yet, they make really, really bad decisions all through life. And I've found myself at times thinking, how could somebody so smart, how could you make decisions like that? We've all met people like that. You look at them and it's like, they are so smart. But then when it comes to making decisions, they are really, really not smart. They make really bad decisions. And wisdom is not only about having knowledge, but wisdom is about knowing how to use what I know. It's about practical implementation. It's about making not only decisions that are the best use or the best response, but which are the godly response as well. And so, how can we gain wisdom? As believers, as followers of Jesus, how can we gain wisdom? What's that? Okay, we can ask God. Of course, Solomon did that, and we're going to skip ahead just a little bit to James chapter 1, verse 5. And James said, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, that giveth to all men liberally and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him. So, if we want wisdom, we can ask God. And I know that for me, there have been lots of times I've asked God. Sometimes on the fly, it's like, Lord, I have no clue what I'm doing here. You better come through for me now. I need wisdom here to do the right thing, to make the right decision. So we can ask of God. What are some other ways that we get wisdom?
Pray about it.
Pardon me?
Pray about the decision.
Okay, to pray about the decision that we're going to make. So praying about the decision that we're going to make is extremely important. And as we do, even if we're not specifically asking for wisdom, but as we pray, God speaks into our lives, gives us wisdom. Patrick?
Possibly trial and error.
Trial and error, otherwise known as the School of Hard Knocks. Yeah, trial and error. Sometimes you learn by doing. And one thing I appreciate when I was starting out in ministry, I got to work with my pastor for 5 years. And I was just young, fresh out of Bible school. I knew all the answers. You know, as you do when you're fresh out of Bible college, and you knew all the answers, and you knew exactly how everything should be, and exactly how it all needed to be done. And thankfully, he was very patient with me. And I discovered that there's a difference between theoretical knowledge and practical knowledge and wisdom. And I look back and I'm thankful that I spent the time that I did, because I learned so much about dealing with people and about how the real world actually works beyond the pages of a textbook. And it spared me a lot of really bad mistakes. I still made my own mistakes, but it saved me some of them. And trial and error, we learn, and trial and error works when we look at our failure and we say, how come it didn't work? How would I do this differently the next time? And then we do it differently the next time. You know, they say the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And so trial and error learning is about, this didn't work, why didn't it work, how can it work the next time, or what do I need to do differently? So trial and error works. Another way? All right, we can read the Bible. That's kind of a given, but it's so important. Read the Bible. The Bible has the answers to most situations in life, at least in principle. And so as we read the Bible, we get God's wisdom into our lives. And the other one that I thought of that goes along with this, yeah, sure, Jen.
Praying the 10 Commandments.
Okay, the 10 Commandments, instituting them within our lives, yeah, absolutely. They give us great direction for life and great guidance for life. The other one that I was thinking of is find wise people. Find people who exhibit wisdom within their lives in dealing with life or dealing with situations, and then ask them. Learn from them. There have been so many people over the years that I have learned things from. And there have been some times that when I didn't know the answer and I really, it just wasn't coming anyway, there have been sometimes that I've called a senior minister and said, hey, look, got this problem. What would you do? How would you handle this? And sometimes all we need is an outside voice that's not in our own head that can sometimes distill the situation down. And when you walk away, you're saying, how come I didn't see that at the time? No, how come I couldn't come up with that? That's so simple. Sometimes an outside voice, and again, somebody that exhibits wisdom, somebody who's making, you don't want to go to somebody who has a habit of making really bad decisions and asking for advice. You want to go to somebody who has exhibited wisdom, who has a track record, and who can help you with it. And so, as we look at Proverbs, to the ancient Jew, wisdom was more than simply good advice or successful planning. It was about bringing God and His wisdom into your life. And I came across a quote that said that wisdom means exhibiting God's character in the many practical affairs of life. Exhibiting God's character, that's what true wisdom is. Exhibiting God's character. And we're going to take a quick look at the book itself. And yeah. We had reading the Bible, we had prayer, we had finding people, and then asking for it. So the book itself is not arranged in topical order. So as you read through it, you'll find that it goes from one subject to another. And so as you read through it, you get instruction on many different topics. And really, we never know from day to day what topic we're going to need. Chapters 1 to 9, wisdom and folly are personified as two women. So he uses a metaphor. And it's interesting because wisdom is a feminine term in the Hebrew. And so they're personified. In chapters 1, 8, and 9, wisdom calls to men and women to follow her, enjoy salvation, wealth, and life. And in chapters 5, 6, and 7, folly calls out to the same people and offers them immediate satisfaction. So you see the back and forth between wisdom and folly. And they're personified as two women. And then in chapters 10 to 15, there's a series of contrasts between the life of wisdom and the life of folly. And in chapters 16 to 31, there's wise counsel. So there are a variety of proverbs on a number of different subjects about different and important areas of life. So that's a basic breakdown of the book. We're not going to be going through the book chapter by chapter. There are 31 chapters. And some of those chapters almost have 31 topics per chapter, so we're not going to do that. But what we are going to do is we are going to be looking at some of the themes through the book of Proverbs. And to get us started next week, we're going to be breaking down chapter 1, and we are going to be looking at it because there is a theme there. And so if you can read through chapter 1, and we'll be looking at it next week. And just as we get ready to wrap up, I wanted to ask, from the introduction of the book, is there one big takeaway that you would have from the introduction, or just from what we've talked about with the book? Is there one big takeaway that would kind of guide you into the rest of the book, or that you look at it and say, that's what I'm taking home from this tonight? There's that one thought, that one thing that kind of stood out to you. Is there anybody that has something like that? Just that one thing that just kind of jumped out at you tonight? I know we haven't really been in the book itself. It's an introduction, but is there that one big thing that kind of speaks to life? Anybody?
It's one of the points that you have that says, Proverbs are generalized statement of what is usually true in
Mhm.
life. So I guess as we read through it, we will see stuff that jumps out of us and say, oh yeah, that is actually things that happen. Like,
Yeah.
soft answer would turn away wrath, and the rest would stir up anger. And we'll be like, yeah, this happened to me in the past. So it's about reading it and understanding how it applies to you on an
Yeah.
everyday.
And I think what's really important too, and as I mentioned when we looked at that, is that they are general statements of truth. They're not promises.
Mhm.
And so sometimes we turn them into promises when they're general statements of truth. So soft answer turns away wrath is a general statement of truth. It's how things usually work. And as you go through, you'll discover that. Anybody else? Sure?
That godly wisdom is the best wisdom and God's ways are the best. There's a lot of very wise people with very strong opinions, but they're not godly opinions. They're not the way we want to go.
Yeah, absolutely. Anybody else?
Verse 7, the fear of the Lord is a beginning of knowledge,
Mm-hmm.
that as we continue to seek Him and give, reverence and obey Him while we're separate and obeys Him.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. And everything about life, particularly as a believer, kind of works out from that point, the fear of the Lord. All right. Anybody else? All right, well, let's stand together as we close in prayer. And as I mentioned, next week we're going to be looking at chapter 1. And so be sure to read through it. And I think as you read through the book of Proverbs, you'll discover there's so many things that Proverbs teaches us that just are so practical in our everyday lives. Is there anybody that needs prayer tonight? All right, well, let's close in prayer. Father, thank you for being with us. Thank you for what we learned from your word. And Lord, what we learn about your word and what we learn about you through your word. I pray that you will continue to speak to us. Lord, let the book of Proverbs speak to us. And Lord, let it be wisdom that's imparted into our lives, Lord, that challenges us in the decisions, Lord, and the things that we have to do. Lord, we praise you for being with us tonight. Keep us in your hands, we pray.